The pre-dawn darkness of October 24th, 1944, hung over the Philippine Sea like a funeral shroud. Aboard the USS Essex, Commander David McCampbell sat in the cramped ready room, nursing his third cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber mixed with diesel fuel. At 34 years old, he was ancient by fighter pilot standards, old enough to know that luck in aerial combat had a definite expiration date, young enough to believe his hadn't arrived yet. As commander of Air Group 15, the so-called Fabled 15, McCampbell carried responsibilities that weighed heavier than any bomb load his aircraft could carry. Every pilot who didn't return was a name he'd have to write in a letter home, every widow and orphan a burden on his conscience. The 19 small Japanese flags painted beneath the canopy of his F6F Hellcat, Missio 3, weren't mere decorations. They were proof that he belonged in the sky, not behind a desk. Around him, young pilots in their early 20s dozed in their chairs or played half-hearted games of cards to pass the interminable waiting. Ensign Roy Rushing, his frequent wingman, was bent over a technical manual in the corner, always studying, always preparing. At 23, Rushing embodied everything a naval aviator should be: sharp eyes that could spot a zero at 10 miles, steady hands that never shook under fire, and the kind of calm demeanor that couldn't be taught in any flight school. McCampbell had flown with many wingmen over the months. Rushing was one of the very best. The previous evening, Admiral Frederick Sherman had pulled McCampbell aside with clear instructions that still rankled. "Dave, you're too valuable to risk on every damn sortie. We need you alive, coordinating operations, not getting yourself shot down playing hero. Let the younger boys handle the routine patrols." McCampbell had nodded with appropriate respect, but the words had stuck in his craw like a chicken bone. He was a fighter pilot. That's what he did. That's who he was, down to his very bones. The ready room's intercom crackled to life at 0615 hours. "First wave, man your aircraft. Dawn patrol launching in 15 minutes. McCampbell watched as half the room stirred to life, pilots grabbing their gear and heading for the door with practiced efficiency. He remained seated, dutifully following orders, sipping his terrible coffee and hating every second of it. Through the steel bulkhead, he could hear the distinctive roar of 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines spinning up to full power, followed by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of catapult launches. Within 20 minutes, the first wave was airborne and heading west toward the Japanese-held island of Luzon, disappearing into the gradually brightening sky. McCampbell checked his watch for the 10th time, 0615 hours. The second wave would launch at 0900. 3 more hours of sitting on his hands, drinking bad coffee, and second-guessing his decision to follow orders instead of instinct. Then the world exploded into chaos. AIR! AIR! The squawk box erupted with such urgency that several pilots actually jumped from their seats, cards scattering across the floor. "Multiple bogeys inbound! All available fighter pilots, man your planes immediately! This is not a drill!" The Combat Information Center's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "We have 3 large formations, 60-plus aircraft, bearing 270, range 25 miles, and closing fast. All fighters, scramble immediately! Repeat, all fighters scramble!" The ready room exploded into controlled chaos. Pilots who'd been half asleep seconds earlier were suddenly wide awake and moving, grabbing flight helmets and Mae West life jackets, racing for the door in a thundering stampede. McCampbell was on his feet before his conscious brain had fully processed what he'd heard, his body reacting on pure instinct, honed by thousands of hours in combat. 60 aircraft, Japanese, inbound. Coming for his fleet. To hell with Admiral Sherman's orders. He grabbed his flight helmet and ran for the door, nearly bowling over a young ensign in his haste to reach the flight deck. Behind him, he could hear Roy Rushing's boots pounding on the deck plates, keeping pace. The flight deck of the Essex was a scene of pure pandemonium. Dive bombers and torpedo planes that had been spotted for the morning strike were being frantically pushed aside by deck crews to make room for fighters. Yellow-shirted plane handlers were shouting orders that were barely audible over the building roar of engines spinning up. In the distance, McCampbell could see anti-aircraft batteries on the destroyer screen, already swiveling their barrels toward the western sky, their crews scrambling to load shells. McCampbell's Hellcat, Missio 3, sat at the number 1 catapult position, a stroke of pure luck he'd remember for the rest of his life. But the plane captain was still frantically hand-pumping fuel into the wing tanks, the hose still connected to the fueling port. "How much fuel?" McCampbell shouted over the din, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony. The plane captain looked up, his young face pale with stress. "Main tanks may be half full, Commander. We weren't scheduled to launch for another 3 hours, and I haven't even started on the reserves." "Doesn't matter. Disconnect and clear the prop, now." "But sir, you won't have enough fuel for—" "I said now, sailor." The plane captain yanked the fuel hose free and stumbled backward. McCampbell hauled himself up the side of the Hellcat using the familiar handholds, his boots finding the footholds without conscious thought after 10,000 hours of flight time. He dropped into the cockpit, the seat conforming to his body like a second skin, worn smooth by countless missions. His hands moved across the instrument panel with the precision of a concert pianist. Fuel mixture rich, throttle cracked 1 inch, carburetor heat off, master arm switch on, gun sight illuminated. Behind him, Roy Rushing was climbing into his own Hellcat with equal urgency. 5 other fighters were being rushed into launch position, but they'd take precious minutes to fuel and arm properly. Minutes the task force simply didn't have. The flight deck officer was spinning his checkered flag overhead in the universal signal to wind up engines. McCampbell advanced the throttle, and the massive 2,000 horsepower R2800 engine roared to life, the 18 cylinders firing in perfect synchronized fury. The entire Hellcat shook like a living creature, eager to be unleashed from its chains. Blue-gray exhaust smoke billowed from the stacks. Through his canopy, McCampbell could see the flight officer looking at him, then at the fuel crew still running away from the aircraft, clearly torn between following proper procedure and the desperate, overwhelming need to get fighters airborne before Japanese bombers started dropping ordnance on American carriers. McCampbell made the decision for him. He released his brakes, and the Hellcat lurched forward under its own power, taxiing toward the catapult. The deck officer's flag came down in a violent slash, giving permission he hadn't technically asked for. McCampbell shoved the throttle to the firewall and braced himself. The Hellcat accelerated down the deck at full military power, 12,500 pounds of fighter aircraft straining against gravity and physics themselves. The catapult shot gave him the boost he needed, and suddenly he was airborne, the Philippine Sea dropping away beneath him as he retracted his landing gear and began an aggressive climbing turn to the west, directly toward the incoming threat. Roy Rushing's Hellcat appeared off his right wing exactly 30 seconds later, tucking into tight combat spread formation with the precision that came from flying together through months of missions. Behind them, McCampbell could see 5 more fighters launching in rapid succession, catapult shots coming every 30 seconds. But he and Rushing were already pulling away from the carrier, their Hellcats clawing for altitude at maximum sustainable climb rate. "Essex Control, this is Dashing Dave," McCampbell called over the radio, using his call sign. "Rushing and I are heading west for the contact. Request vector to intercept." The voice that came back belonged to Lieutenant John Connolly, the fighter direction officer, and it carried unmistakable strain. "Roger, Dave. Bogey's bearing 270, range 18 miles and closing, altitude mixed from 1,000 to 25,000 feet. They're organized in 3 separate formations, Dave. Jesus Christ, there must be 60 of them minimum, maybe more. Radar's having trouble sorting them all out." "Understood, Control. We see them on the plot. We're going in." There was a long pause filled with radio static. When Connolly spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of professional admiration and personal disbelief. "Dave, you're telling me you're going in with just 2 aircraft against 60-plus Japanese?" "The rest of the fighters are 5 minutes behind us," McCampbell replied with a calm he didn't entirely feel. "Rushing and I will engage and disrupt their formations. Buy you some time to get more aircraft up." Another pause, even longer this time. "Roger that. Good hunting, Commander." And Dave, for what it's worth, Godspeed. McCampbell checked his fuel gauge, and his heart sank slightly. The needle sat stubbornly at just over half tanks, maybe 125 gallons in the main tank, with the reserve tank still virtually empty. In a perfect world, he'd want full tanks, 250 gallons, for what he was about to do. But the world was far from perfect. The Japanese didn't give a damn about his fuel state, and American sailors were depending on him to do his job. He switched to the tactical frequency. "Roy, we're going to need every advantage we can manufacture here. We'll use the sun and altitude. Climb to 30,000 feet. Then we'll hit them with diving attacks from directly above. Speed and surprise are all we've got." "Roger that, Skipper," Rushing's voice came back, steady as always. "Right behind you." The two Hellcats continued their climb, the altimeters unwinding in reverse as they ascended through layers of scattered clouds. Through breaks in the cloud cover, McCampbell could see the American task force spread out below them like toys in a bathtub. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers arranged in their protective formation across miles of blue-gray ocean. Thousands of men whose lives now depended on two fighter pilots doing their job against impossible odds. At 15,000 feet, McCampbell spotted them, and his blood ran cold. It started as a dark smudge on the western horizon, like a storm cloud that shouldn't be there. But as they climbed higher and the range closed, the smudge resolved into something that made every instinct scream at him to turn around and run. The Japanese formation stretched across the sky like a biblical plague of locusts. Zero fighters with their distinctive rounded wingtips, Oscar fighters with their inline engines, Judy dive bombers with their fixed landing gear, all organized into three distinct waves stacked at different altitudes like a deadly layer cake. "Christ almighty," Rushing breathed over the radio, his usual calm finally cracking. "Skipper, there's got to be 80 of them, maybe 90. McCampbell's trained eye rapidly assessed the tactical situation with the cold calculation that separated dead pilots from living ones. The Japanese had overwhelming numbers, but they'd made a critical strategic mistake that he could exploit. Their fighters were loaded down with external drop tanks, those teardrop-shaped fuel containers slung under their bellies and wings, which sacrificed maneuverability and performance for the extended range needed to fly all the way from their bases on Luzon. And critically, they hadn't yet spotted the two American fighters climbing above them into the sun. "Roy, I count approximately 40 fighters at 20,000 feet, another 20 or so bombers below them at 10,000, and scattered elements in between. The fighters are our immediate threat. If we can break up their formation, create chaos and confusion, the bombers will scatter like pigeons." "What's the tactical plan, Skipper?" Rushing asked, and McCampbell could hear the underlying question. How the hell do two fighters take on 80? McCampbell's mind raced through the tactical geometry, calculating angles and speeds and energy states. Two fighters against 40 escorts and 20 bombers. The odds were mathematically suicidal. Unless you fundamentally change the equation of the engagement. "We stay above them and use speed and altitude as our primary advantages," he said, thinking it through as he spoke. "We'll make high-speed diving attacks from out of the sun, shoot on the dive, then use our accumulated energy to climb back up before they can react and bring their guns to bear. Never get slow, never turn with them in a horizontal fight. Our Hellcats are faster and heavier than Zeros, especially in a dive. We use that advantage ruthlessly." "And when they figure out our pattern and start positioning to intercept us on the climb?" Rushing asked. It was a valid tactical question. McCampbell allowed himself a grim smile behind his oxygen mask. "Then we improvise like our lives depend on it, because they will." They reached 30,000 feet, the Hellcat's engines straining and coughing in the thin air. Below them, the Japanese formation droned onward toward the American fleet, seemingly oblivious to the two predators positioned like hawks above a flock of fat pigeons. McCampbell could see individual aircraft now, the distinctive elliptical wings of Zero fighters with their underwing drop tanks clearly visible, the longer fuselages and fixed landing gear of Judy dive bombers. Somewhere in those cockpits were men just like him, pilots who'd trained for years, who had families and dreams and fears, men who were just doing their jobs and trying to survive another day of this brutal war. But they were coming for his fleet, for his carriers, for his fellow pilots and the mechanics and sailors who kept them flying. And that made all the difference in the world. Roy, I'm taking the section leader on the right side. You take the element leader on the left. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark! Commander David McCampbell rolled his Hellcat inverted until he was hanging in his straps, looking down through his canopy at the enemy formation 5,000 feet below. Then he pushed his stick forward and committed himself to the attack. The altimeter began unwinding rapidly as gravity took enthusiastic hold. 29,000 feet. 27,000. 25,000. The dive was everything McCampbell simultaneously loved and feared about flying. The Hellcat accelerated with terrifying rapidity, the airspeed indicator needle sweeping past 300 knots, then 350, then 400 knots. The wind screamed past the canopy like a living thing. The aircraft vibrated with barely restrained power, the control surfaces stiffening as speed increased. Through his illuminated gun sight, a Zero fighter grew larger with each passing second, the image expanding from a tiny dot to a recognizable aircraft to a target filling his windscreen. McCampbell's right hand rested lightly on the stick, making minute corrections as he aligned the shot. His left hand was poised on the throttle quadrant. His right thumb hovered over the gun trigger on the stick grip. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total of pure mechanical devastation waiting to be unleashed. At 23,000 feet, still in the dive and still accelerating past 420 knots, the Zero pilot finally sensed danger. Perhaps he caught a glint of sunlight off McCampbell's canopy, or maybe some sixth sense screamed a warning. The Japanese fighter began a lazy turn to the right. Too little, too late, too slow. McCampbell waited with predatory patience. Let the range close. Closer. The illuminated gun sight pipper settled on the Zero's fuselage, just behind the cockpit where the main fuel tank was located in Japanese fighters. The Japanese loved to save weight by not installing self-sealing fuel tanks. That decision was about to kill this pilot. At 1,000 feet range, point blank by aerial combat standards, McCampbell pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 50 caliber guns opened fire simultaneously in a hammering roar. Tracers, every 5th round painted with phosphorus, drew brilliant lines through the sky, converging on the Zero like fingers of light. The other 4 out of every 5 rounds were invisible, armor-piercing, and incendiary rounds, but their impact was anything but invisible. Chunks of aluminum tore away from the Zero's wing root. Control surfaces shredded. Then, brilliantly, a bright orange flash as a 50 caliber incendiary round found the unprotected fuel tank. The Zero simply disintegrated. One moment it was a functioning aircraft with a living human being inside. The next moment it was a fireball tumbling through the sky, trailing black smoke and burning fuel and pieces of aluminum skin. "Splash one!" Rushing's voice crackled over the radio. McCampbell glanced right and saw another Zero spiraling downward out of control, its entire tail section shot completely away, the pilot surely dead. But there was absolutely no time to celebrate or even to think. The Japanese formation erupted like someone had kicked a massive anthill. Zeros were frantically jettisoning their drop tanks and pulling into hard turns, trying desperately to bring their guns to bear on the attackers who'd appeared from nowhere. Radio chatter exploded in rapid Japanese, voices urgent and angry. McCampbell pulled back hard on the stick, using every bit of the Hellcat's tremendous accumulated kinetic energy to zoom climb back toward altitude. The G-forces pressed him brutally into his seat. 3 Gs, 4, 5, then 6 Gs at the top of the climb. His vision narrowed dangerously at the edges as blood drained from his head toward his feet, the beginning of grayout. He tensed his leg and stomach muscles violently, fighting to keep blood in his brain, fighting to stay conscious. The Hellcat climbed like a homesick angel, trading speed for altitude, leaving the now alerted Zeros far below and unable to follow the high-speed climb. "Roy, fuel status." 75%, Skipper." McCampbell checked his own gauge with growing concern. 60% already. They'd burned through fuel faster than expected in the maximum power climb and the dive. Mental calculation based on years of experience, maybe 45 minutes of combat time remaining before they'd absolutely have to break off and head for home. 45 minutes to somehow stop 80 Japanese aircraft from reaching the American carriers. At 28,000 feet, McCampbell leveled off and looked down at the tactical situation. The Japanese formation was in temporary disarray, fighters milling about in confusion trying to locate their attackers, bomber pilots nervously scanning the sky. Perfect. Confusion and chaos were the defenders' best friends.
"Roy, you see that group of Judies at 12,000 feet? They're heading straight for our task force on a direct attack bearing. We need to break up that formation before they get into dive bombing range." "I see them, Skipper. Count 8 dive bombers in a loose V formation. I'm going for the formation leader. You take the trailing aircraft on the right side. We'll work our way through the formation from opposite ends and meet in the middle." McCampbell rolled into another diving attack, this time targeting the lead Judy dive bomber. The Judy was a relatively new aircraft, significantly faster than the older Val dive bombers, and it carried a deadly 550-pound bomb, enough explosive power to cripple a destroyer or punch a hole clean through a carrier's flight deck and detonate in the hangar bay below. The geometry was different this time. The Judy's pilot spotted McCampbell's diving attack and immediately pushed his nose down, trying to use his own dive to build speed and escape. But McCampbell had both altitude and speed advantages. He adjusted his dive angle steeper, leading the target, compensating for deflection as the bomber maneuvered. The Judy grew rapidly in his gun sight, filling the illuminated reticle. Range, 1,200 feet. Still too far for a guaranteed kill shot. Wait, 1,000 feet. Still too far with a maneuvering target. Patience. The Judy was in a steep dive now, the pilot desperately trying to use speed to survive. McCampbell nosed over even steeper, following the bomber down, his airspeed indicator touching 450 knots. The Hellcat's control surfaces were becoming stiff and heavy, requiring real physical force to move. His whole aircraft shook violently, rivets straining, sheet metal flexing. He was pushing the Hellcat to its structural limits. 800 feet. The rear gunner finally spotted him and opened fire, his light 7.7mm machine gun spitting tracers that reached out toward McCampbell like angry fireflies. McCampbell ignored them. The light machine gun wasn't powerful enough to penetrate the Hellcat's armored cockpit and engine from this range and angle. But he respected the raw courage of that Japanese gunner. That sailor was doing his duty, defending his aircraft and his pilot, knowing full well that he was outgunned and almost certainly doomed. There was a kind of honor in that, even in an enemy. McCampbell angled his approach slightly to minimize his exposure to the gunner's field of fire, coming in from below and to the left where the gun couldn't easily track. The Judy grew even larger, 600 feet, 500, 400. He could see individual details now, the bomb slung under the fuselage like an obscene egg, the pilot's leather helmet visible through the greenhouse canopy, the rising sun insignia painted on the tail. 400 feet. He pulled lead, compensating for the Judy's downward movement and his own closure rate. His finger tightened on the trigger, taking up the slack. Then, for just a fraction of a second, maybe a tenth of a second, maybe less, David McCampbell hesitated. He thought about the pilot in that cockpit. Someone's son. Someone's brother. Maybe someone's father. A man who'd trained for years at some Japanese naval air station, who'd survived countless missions, who'd woken up this morning in a barracks somewhere on Luzon thinking about home, about family, about the girl he might marry when the war finally ended. But that bomb under the Judy's belly was aimed at an American carrier, at his carrier, the Essex, at his fellow pilots sleeping in their racks, at his mechanics working in the hangar bay,
at the kids from Iowa and Texas and California who were just doing their jobs, at Roy Rushing, at Chief O'Brien, at men whose lives were his responsibility to protect. The hesitation lasted less than a human heartbeat. McCampbell fired. The burst was textbook perfect, a deflection shot that any gunnery instructor would have used as a training example. The stream of 50 caliber rounds walked up the Judy's fuselage from engine cowling back through the cockpit. The bomber shuddered under the hammering impacts like it had hit invisible turbulence. The propeller seized immediately, frozen by a destroyed engine. Smoke poured from the cowling in thick black streams, then bright orange flames. The Judy rolled slowly to the right and nosed over steeper, beginning its final uncontrolled plunge toward the ocean. McCampbell pulled up sharply to avoid the falling bomber, the G-forces crushing him again. As he climbed away, he saw the rear gunner bail out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. The pilot didn't follow, perhaps already dead from McCampbell's rounds through the cockpit, perhaps wounded and unable to escape, perhaps making the ultimate sacrifice to try guiding his crippled bomber onto a target even as it fell. The Judy hit the Pacific 2 miles from the nearest American destroyer, the bomb detonating on impact and sending up a massive geyser of water 300 feet high. The explosion was visible from the carrier decks, and McCampbell later learned that sailors watching from the Essex cheered when they saw it, not knowing or understanding how desperately close they'd come to disaster. "Splash 2, McCampbell reported quietly over the radio, his voice flat and professional. "3 down, Rushing added almost immediately. "But Skipper, we've got serious company now. 6 Zeros climbing toward us from below, and they look angry." McCampbell craned his neck, scanning the sky with the constant vigilance that kept fighter pilots alive. There, 6 Zeros in a loose finger 4 formation, climbing aggressively toward them from below and behind. The Japanese pilots had figured out the American tactic and were trying to intercept them before they could make another diving attack. "I see them, Roy. We split up. They can't effectively chase both of us. We'll regroup in 3 minutes at Angels 25, heading 090. Break on my mark. Break!" The 2 Hellcats broke violently in opposite directions, McCampbell banking hard right while Rushing went left. 3 of the Zeros followed McCampbell, 3 went after Rushing. Standard tactics, divide and conquer. McCampbell noted with grim satisfaction that the Zeros had jettisoned their drop tanks now, making them lighter and more maneuverable, but severely limiting their range. They'd have to break off the engagement soon to avoid running out of fuel over open ocean. But soon wasn't now. And right now, 3 skilled Japanese pilots were trying very hard to kill him. The lead Zero was closing fast, the pilot expertly pulling lead for a deflection shot. McCampbell watched the closing angle with the calculating detachment born of hundreds of combat hours, his mind automatically solving the trigonometry of aerial combat. The Zero's nose lit up with muzzle flashes, 20mm cannon fire mixed with 7.7mm machine gun fire, tracers reaching out toward him like strings of deadly pearls. McCampbell snap-rolled left 90 degrees, then immediately pulled hard, reversing his turn. The Zeros burst past harmlessly behind him, missing by perhaps 20 yards. The Japanese pilot tried to follow the maneuver, but the Zero, nimble as it was in sustained turns, couldn't match the Hellcat's superior roll rate and raw power. By the time the Zero completed its roll and began pulling in the new direction, McCampbell had reversed again, and now, suddenly the tactical situation had flipped. The hunter had become the hunted. The Zero pilot, realizing his tactical mistake, immediately pushed forward into a steep dive, trying to use gravity to build up speed and separation. It was a reasonable defensive maneuver against most fighters, but McCampbell had been waiting for exactly this reaction. He rolled, inverted, and pulled hard, following the Zero down, the Hellcat's superior diving speed closing the range with mathematical inevitability. 600 feet. 500. 400. McCampbell fired a short 2-second burst. Most rounds missed. He'd led too much, misjudged the deflection slightly. Tracers passed ahead of the diving Zero. He adjusted his aim point, compensating,
and fired again. This time his rounds stitched across the Zero's left wing root. The fabric covering tore away in ragged strips, exposing the wing's internal aluminum structure and wooden ribs. The Zero rolled hard right, streaming white smoke, probably glycol coolant from a punctured cooling system. McCampbell followed the maneuver, pulled lead to account for the turn, and fired a longer, 3-second burst. The tracers converged beautifully on the Zero's engine cowling. There was a bright flash, then streaming liquid, definitely coolant now. The Zero's propeller began windmilling uselessly as the engine seized from overheating. The Japanese pilot had perhaps 10 seconds to make his decision: ride the crippled fighter down in a dead-stick landing on the ocean, almost certainly fatal in the wave conditions, or bail out and take his chances with the parachute and the sharks and hoping for rescue. He chose survival. The canopy flew off, tumbling away, and a moment later the pilot tumbled clear of the dying aircraft, his parachute blossoming white against the azure sky. "Splash 4, McCampbell reported, already banking away from the descending parachute and scanning for the next threat. The other two Zeros that had been chasing him were nowhere immediately visible. They'd either broken off to conserve fuel or were now engaged with rushing. "Roy, status report?" There was a pause filled with the sound of heavy breathing and the distant rattle of machine gun fire over the radio. Then Rushing's voice came back, still remarkably calm. "Still very much here, Skipper. Lost my 3 Zeros down at the deck. I think they had to bug out for fuel. Heading back up to Angels 2-5 now." McCampbell checked his watch with growing concern. They'd been in continuous combat for just 14 minutes, though it felt like hours. His shoulders ached from fighting the Hellcat's heavy controls at high speed. His flight suit was completely soaked with sweat despite the frigid air at altitude. His mouth was desert dry, tasting of adrenaline and fear and the peculiar metallic taste that came with extreme stress. But 14 minutes. Just 14 minutes. And 4 Japanese aircraft destroyed. He looked west toward the Japanese formation, and his heart sank like a stone. Despite the losses they'd inflicted, despite the chaos and confusion, the main body of Japanese aircraft was still pushing relentlessly toward the American task force. He could see the tight formation of bomb-laden Judies in the center, now surrounded by a protective screen of Zero fighters flying close escort. The Japanese had adapted to the threat, tightened their formation, learned from their losses. They were maybe 18 miles from the American carriers now, perhaps 12 minutes of flight time at their current speed. "Essex Control, Dashing Dave. Where the hell are our reinforcements?" McCampbell called, unable to keep the frustration completely out of his voice. Lieutenant Connolly's response crackled back immediately. "Dave, we have 8 additional fighters airborne now, but they're still 8 minutes out from the contact. You need to keep those bombers away from the task force, whatever it takes." 8 minutes. In aerial combat, 8 minutes was an eternity. It was also a death sentence if you made a single mistake. "Roger, Control. Rushing and I will do what we can." McCampbell climbed back to 27,000 feet, his engine straining and coughing in protest. Below him, the Japanese formation had reorganized itself into a much tighter defensive posture. No more easy diving attacks from above. They'd learned, adapted, and now presented a much harder target. The bomber formation was packed tight, with Zeros weaving above and around them in a protective combat air patrol pattern. McCampbell needed a new approach. The Japanese had tightened their formation, making high-altitude diving attacks far more dangerous. But they'd also created a weakness. By bunching up for mutual protection, they'd limited their own maneuverability. He studied the formation with a predator's eye, looking for an opening, a vulnerability, anything he could exploit. Then he saw it. A slight gap between the fighter escort and the bombers, maybe 300 yards of empty air. If he could punch through that gap at high speed, he could hit the bombers before the escorts could react. It was audacious. It was probably suicidal. It was also the only play that might work. "Roy, I'm going to try something extremely aggressive," McCampbell said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm diving straight through their fighter screen to hit the bombers directly. The Zeros will turn to chase me. That's when you hammer them from above,
while they're focused on me. There was a long pause. Skipper, that's insane. I know, but we're out of time and options. Trust me on this. Always have, always will. I'm right behind you. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat into what old-timers called a split S, inverted, then pulling through into a near-vertical dive. The nose came down, 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 until it pointed almost straight at the ocean 5 miles below, and the Hellcat fell like a stone thrown from heaven. The airspeed built with terrifying rapidity. 350 knots, 400, 450, 470. The Hellcat was shaking so violently that McCampbell's vision blurred. His teeth rattled. The control stick vibrated in his hand. Every rivet and weld in the airframe was being tested to its absolute structural limit. The Zeros spotted him when he was still 5,000 feet above them. He saw their formation break apart as fighters peeled off to intercept, their pilots' training and instincts driving them to meet the threat. Radio chatter exploded in rapid Japanese, voices urgent and angry. 4,000 feet to the bomber formation. 3 Zeros were turning hard to cut him off, pulling incredible G-forces. 3,000 feet. More Zeros joining the intercept, at least 8 fighters now converging on his position from multiple angles. 2,000 feet. Almost there. A Zero flashed directly across his nose from left to right, the pilot attempting a desperate snapshot. McCampbell heard and felt the hammering of 20mm cannon fire, felt the Hellcat shudder as rounds passed close enough to rock the aircraft in their turbulent wake. His left wingtip showed 2 new holes. 1,500 feet. He ignored the Zeros, ignored the tracers filling the sky around him, ignored everything except the lead Judy dive bomber in his gun sight, growing larger every fraction of a second. 1,000 feet. Range perfect. He pressed the trigger and held it down. All 6 50 calibers hammered in a sustained 4-second burst, sending a devastating stream of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds into the Judy. The effect was catastrophic and immediate. The rounds punched through the bomber's thin aluminum skin, through critical systems, through fuel lines. Then, brilliantly and terribly, the 550-pound bomb exploded while still attached to the aircraft. The detonation was tremendous. The Judy simply vaporized, transformed from aircraft to expanding fireball in a microsecond. The blast wave rocked McCampbell's Hellcat even at 800 feet distance. Burning debris scattered across a quarter-mile of sky. The 2 Judys flying in close formation beside the leader were caught in the explosion. One immediately fell away trailing fire. The other staggered in the air, its wings shredded. McCampbell pulled up with every ounce of strength, fighting both the G-forces and the turbulence from the explosion. He was in the absolute heart of the furball now, a chaotic 3-dimensional knife fight where friend and foe were impossible to distinguish, where death could come from any angle, where survival was measured in fractions of seconds. A Zero appeared directly in front of him, so close he could see the pilot's face, see the rising sun insignia on the fuselage, see the oil streaks on the cowling. No time to think, to plan, to aim. Pure instinct. McCampbell fired a snapshot burst. The rounds caught the Zero dead center, punching through the engine and cockpit. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke and flame. 6! McCampbell shouted, his voice raw. Heads up, Skipper! You've got 3 more on your 6 o'clock! Rushing's urgent voice. McCampbell banked violently right, then snapped left. Tracers filled the space where he'd been a heartbeat before. He pulled up into a chandelle, then reversed into a split S. His altimeter was unwinding. 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. He was getting dangerously low, running out of sky. The 3 Zeros stayed with him, their pilots good, anticipating his moves, working as a team. McCampbell felt multiple impacts, metallic bangs as 7.7mm rounds struck his aircraft. Damage warning lights flickered red on his instrument panel. His oil pressure gauge was dropping. He needed to change the dynamics immediately. In a move that went against every instinct and training, McCampbell chopped his throttle to idle and extended his landing gear. The sudden, massive drag slowed the Hellcat dramatically, like throwing an anchor. The three Zeros, traveling at over 350 knots, shot past him like bullets. For one perfect, beautiful moment, the tactical situation reversed completely. The Zeros were in front, McCampbell behind. The lead Japanese pilot, realizing his catastrophic error, pulled up hard and rolled right, trying desperately to escape. McCampbell retracted his gear, shoved the throttle to the firewall, and pulled lead. The Zero was climbing steeply, presenting its vulnerable belly, the most exposed part of any aircraft. McCampbell's gunsight Pipper tracked smoothly up the Zero's fuselage from tail to engine cowling. He fired a sustained burst that lasted nearly 5 seconds, walking his rounds deliberately along the entire length of the enemy fighter. Aluminum skin peeled away, control surfaces disintegrated, smoke poured from the cowling, then orange flames. The Zero rolled inverted and dove straight into the Philippine Sea, hitting the water at over 300 knots. The impact was violent enough to disintegrate the aircraft completely. 7, McCampbell reported, his voice hoarse from breathing hard into his oxygen mask. He leveled off at 4,000 feet and took stock. The furball had scattered across 10 miles of sky. Individual dogfights raged at various altitudes. He could see tracers, smoke trails, aircraft maneuvering violently. In the distance, Roy Rushing's Hellcat was chasing 2 Zeros, the American fighter's superior speed slowly closing the gap. Further out, he could see fresh American fighters arriving, finally diving into the fight. But what caught McCampbell's attention, what made his blood run cold despite the sweat pouring down his face, was a single Judy dive bomber, separated from its formation, making a desperate solo run for the task force. The bomber was at 2,000 feet, flying straight and level, its pilot absolutely focused on reaching his target. The American carriers were now visible on the horizon, maybe 10 miles away. 3 minutes of flight time, maybe less. McCampbell checked his fuel gauge and his stomach dropped. 35%. Maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining, and that was if he didn't have to maneuver hard or use military power. He checked his ammunition counter. Roughly 400 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. 1 good burst. Maybe 2 if he was lucky and accurate. Make it count, Dave. Make every round count. He advanced the throttle and turned toward the Judy. The Hellcat's big R2800 engine responding with a satisfying roar, despite the punishment it had taken. The distance closed rapidly. 8 miles, 7, 6. The bomber was flying low, trying to stay under the American radar coverage, the pilot playing his last desperate card. At 4 miles, the Judy's rear gunner spotted McCampbell and opened fire with his single 7.7mm machine gun, tracers reaching out in a thin stream. McCampbell angled his approach to stay outside the gunner's effective field of fire, coming in from below and to the left where the gun's traverse was limited. Professional respect flickered through his mind. That gunner was doing his absolute best with inadequate weapons, defending his aircraft and pilot to the very end. The Judy grew steadily in his sight. 1,000 feet, 800, 600. He could see every detail now, the bomb still attached to its belly rack, the pilot's brown leather helmet visible through the greenhouse canopy, the faded paint on the tail showing this was an aircraft that had seen many missions. 400 feet. He pulled lead carefully, compensating for the Judy's movement and his own closure rate. His finger moved to the trigger, taking up the slack. He thought, just for an instant, about that pilot, about the family in Japan who would receive a telegram, about dreams that would die today. Then he thought about the Essex, about the sailors sleeping in their racks who would never wake up if that bomb found its target, about Roy Rushing, about Chief O'Brien and his plane crew, about the kid from Nebraska who served him terrible coffee every morning. McCampbell fired his final burst. The rounds converged perfectly, a textbook deflection shot that walked from engine through cockpit to tail. The Judy shuddered violently. The propeller froze. Fire erupted from the engine cowling. The bomber nosed over into a steepening dive. The rear gunner bailed out, his parachute deploying. The pilot didn't follow. Perhaps he was already dead.
Perhaps he was too injured to escape. Perhaps he was making one final attempt to guide his dying aircraft onto a target. The Judy hit the ocean 2 miles from the USS Essex, the bomb detonating on impact, sending up a geyser of water 300 feet high. Sailors on the carrier's deck stopped their work to watch, some pointing, some cheering, none of them understanding how close they'd come to catastrophe. 9, McCampbell said quietly into his radio, almost unable to believe it himself. Lieutenant Connolly's voice came back, shaking with emotion. Dave, did you just say 9? As in 9 aircraft? Affirmative, Control. 9 confirmed kills. There was a long, stunned silence on the radio. Then, Jesus Christ, Dave. The whole task force has been listening. You and Rushing? You two broke up that entire attack. The bombers are scattering. The fighters are running for home. We've got fresh fighters in the air mopping up stragglers now, but you actually did it. McCampbell didn't respond immediately. He was too busy processing what had just happened, trying to make sense of the impossible mathematics. 9 aircraft. In one mission. In less than 30 minutes of combat. Then reality crashed back in. His fuel gauge showed 20%, maybe 15 minutes of flight time remaining, and that was optimistic. His engine was running rough, missing on at least one cylinder. His oil pressure was in the yellow. Multiple warning lights glowed on his instrument panel. Essex Control, Dashing Dave requesting immediate vector back to home plate. Fuel state critical, aircraft damaged. Roger, Dave. Vector 090, range 35 miles. You're cleared for straight-in approach. We'll have the deck ready. Dave, welcome home. 35 miles. Roughly 10 minutes at economical cruise power if his engine held together. It would be desperately close. Roy, what's your fuel state? Rushing's voice was calm as ever, steady as a rock. 40%, Skipper. I'm good to escort you all the way home. Roger that. Let's go home. The 2 Hellcats turned east, leaving behind a sky full of smoke trails, debris, and the wreckage of broken dreams. Behind them, fresh American fighters were mopping up the scattered remnants of the Japanese attack. But McCampbell barely noticed. All his focus, all his remaining energy was concentrated on that fuel gauge and that rough-running engine and the carrier somewhere ahead. The flight back should have been routine, but with critically low fuel and a damaged aircraft, nothing was routine. At 5 miles out, his engine coughed once, then twice, then began coughing continuously. Come on, baby, McCampbell muttered, coaxing the Hellcat forward. Just a little farther. You brought me through the fight. Don't quit on me now. 2 miles. The engine was barely running, producing maybe 50% power. His airspeed was bleeding off. 160 knots. 150. 140. He was going to come up short of the carrier, going to have to ditch in the ocean. Then he remembered the emergency fuel pump, designed for exactly this situation, to squeeze out every last drop. He flipped the switch. The pump whined. The engine caught, sputtered, then roared back to partial life. The Essex filled his windscreen. The landing signal officer's paddles guided him in. McCampbell chopped power on the signal. The engine quit immediately, the propeller windmilling uselessly. The Hellcat dropped, crossed the fantail with feet to spare, and slammed onto the deck. His tailhook grabbed the number 2 wire. The Hellcat jerked to a violent stop. Silence. McCampbell sat there, hands shaking, body trembling, suddenly aware he was completely soaked with sweat. He'd survived. Against all odds, against all logic, he'd survived. Chief O'Brien appeared at his cockpit. Commander, you okay? Yeah, Chief, I'm okay. Sir, your aircraft. It's shot to hell. There are holes everywhere. McCampbell looked at his Hellcat, really looked at it. Bullet holes riddled the fuselage and tail. The canopy rail had a hole inches from where his head had been. One aileron was shredded. She brought me home, Chief. That makes her special. O'Brien nodded slowly. Commander,
9 aircraft. 9 in one mission. That's impossible. Yeah, McCampbell said quietly, climbing out on shaking legs. Yeah, it is. The deck had gone silent. Every sailor, every mechanic, every officer was staring at him. In the distance, he could see Admiral Sherman heading his way. David McCampbell had just entered the history books. He'd set a record that would never be broken. 9 aerial victories in a single mission. The United States Navy's greatest single achievement in aerial combat. But all he felt was tired, and grateful, and very, very lucky. The war would continue. There would be more missions, more combat, more chances to die. But today, on October 24th, 1944, Commander David McCampbell had achieved something that would echo through history. 9 victories. 1 morning. 1 man who became a legend. The end. Historical note. Commander David McCampbell's 9 victories in 1 mission remain the U.S. Navy's single mission record. He ended the war as the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed kills and received the Medal of Honor. He survived the war and lived until 1996, passing away at age 86. His achievement on October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, stands as one of the greatest feats in the history of aerial combat.